Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the aBlogtoWatch Superlative Podcast. My guest today is Jonathan Bordell. He is the co-founder of Helicon Watch. Jonathan, welcome.
Welcome to you. What a fabulous opportunity it is to be with you and be on your great podcast.
I appreciate that. You were telling me you were a fan. That's good. You know, I record the show so that people listen. It's very fortunate that works out.
I think we've had a long relationship, and I've always been so impressed because whenever I've written to you, and sometimes, I mean, you tell me if I do it wrong, sometimes you write an article and I write to you after you've written the article saying, I agree with you there, Ariel, you've raised a good point there, because I genuinely think when we're in the industry, and I have many hats within the industry, I think we should be looking at journalists to inform us, and I want you to give me new ideas. So I'm hungry for someone to give me even an opinion I don't really want to hear. I think it's so valuable. So a privilege to be here, and I love the podcast.
You know, I was fortunate to be of the generation where I grew up with these people whose profession was telling the news or sharing an opinion. And, you know, they studied, they went to school for it, and they were taught like there's like ethics and there's like laws and there's societal expectations and there's the right and wrong way to do it. And, you know, there was degrees for this stuff. And I didn't have one of those degrees, but I took a lot of those classes and I was fascinated by this personality. So when I went into this myself, it was sort of this obvious thing that you had to have a lot of ethics and scruples. That was the only way to like last a long time and do it the right way. Boy, was I the minority in having that opinion. So I think it makes sense to me why I am the way I am, but at the same time, I'm not shocked that it is a very challenging space. And I spend a lot of my time, interestingly enough, and you'll find this funny, my team actually started this trend where they'll be like, hey, there's all this misinformation out there spread by like dumb influencers. Can you write an article that tells people to warn them or to say that's wrong? Like that becomes a lot of what I have to do now is like being the fact checker. It's very strange. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think, you know what's interesting? My father was in the theatre. He wasn't an actor, but he did a lot of work on stage and he would interview actors. Pre-internet days. I'm sure if we were in the days of the internet when he was doing it, he'd be very famous now. And the one thing he taught me is listen. And I think with a lot of digital communication now, it's coming at you with one voice. There's not a lot of interplay. And I think the great thing with all of what we try and do with these podcasts is it's a conversation. And I hopefully will leave you points to listen. But I love to listen to people's views because being an industry veteran, I suppose I can call myself a veteran, doesn't mean I know it all because the industry is changing as everything is all the time.
You first messaged me, I just checked, it was back in 2012, right. Which is funny. That was 2 years after I did my first watch podcast, which was the first watch podcast that I hosted with Sean Biggs. And those were a lot of fun. What were you doing in 2012 in the watch industry?
So if I can go back in time, I had a bit of a strange career path. So I was always interested in watches. My grandfather was a watchmaker. But if I can cast your mind back to really the early 80s, I would come home from school. He would be working in his workshop at home. I would be at his house because the bus would stop outside his house and my parents would pick me up when they finished work. But at that time, watchmaking was dying. I mean, he was saying, no one's really interested in watches. Everyone just wants to buy a quartz watch. You know, don't go into this trade, grandson. This will be failing soon. So it was very much a dying industry. But because I sat there by his bench looking at all these fascinating tools and articles, and there was always something on the edges of the benches, it had a fascination of watches with me. I didn't go into the industry. I took some strange turns to end up where I was. And I was in the real estate industry, doing a lot of planning and design and of those areas which we would now call, you know, the new areas, the up-and-coming areas. I was there when it wasn't up-and-coming. So changing a lot of commercial space into residential space. I exited that business in 2007, just in time, and was really doing a few things. And the one thing that I always remembered and stay with me is watches. So I made these forays into the watch industry, and I literally, because a lot of the watches that I liked weren't even available in retailers in the UK, I would literally get in my car because I was used to driving around Europe, and I would literally turn up at people in Switzerland and Germany and knock on the door and say, hello, I'm an enthusiast. Can you show me what you do? And there was always a puzzled look, after which there was fascination. And then I always headed to the watchmakers, never the marketing suite or the coffee machine. And I think from that, I thought, hold on, there's watch brands here with great stories to tell. I went to Basel when it was really quite a difficult place to enter as a non-trade person. And I'm sure that you and I were at the same time where, you know, they didn't really know why people like you and I were there. I mean, you weren't a retailer, you weren't on their guest list, you weren't ready to take, it was even hard to get a drink on the stands. But I think at that time, I decided to start an online business selling watches on the internet from brands that had no representation in the UK. So that's probably where I was seeing the few podcasts, or the only podcast, and then websites where people were actually talking essentially my language, the enthusiast language.
Were you surprised at how difficult it was to get this business off the ground? Because you knew this product was going to do well, that you knew that there was buyers out there. You had a good taste in watches, as I told you a few times. But the brands, they always sort of made it an uphill battle. You had it made for a while. Unfortunately, not everything lasts forever. That is the nature of retail. Yeah. But did it shock you? Because I know that I've met a lot of people like you. I was there. You go in so enthusiastically, the watch brand is like, oh my God, I have this thing that could help you. Let's do cool stuff together. And then they're like, not this again. and you're like, why do you have to be such a bugbear about it, guys? I mean, come on.
Well, I think I was shocked about it. I'd been in other industries. I'd had feelers in the real estate industry. I'd had feelers in the classic car business. And most people there are interested in new ideas and know the world is changing. I think the watch industry wasn't prepared to change. And I think there were layers of luxury they thought they could put on things, or ambassadorship or sponsorship that would actually get them through because they were alone as the watch industry. And I always felt, I don't know about you, but when you went to places like Basel and we all crowded around outside under the shade, it felt like we were all sort of washed up on the beach. We'd been to sea. The currents had been very strong. We'd been washing around like this. And then all these people were recovering, coming out of the show, going, are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. You okay? Where are you staying tonight? Do you know where there's affordable food? But I think the big danger, and they felt it then, was because our major marketing tool was the internet. And they didn't like the sound of the internet. So I remember the big quote, which I remember to this day, because I always went with my wife, who's co-partners in this business, and she's been in the business as long as I have, is the internet is for teenagers and poor people. That's what I was told. So I think they felt they could usurp the internet and continue to do more of the same, whereas we know in what we do today and what they do, that the world is forever changing. It's changed in the last year, I think. So, yeah, I was totally shocked. And it took a long time for me to say, I'll invest with my own money. I'll put orders through. No, I'm not going to discount. And I think the big thing they saw was actually in the end, I was generating a lot of content. That's what I saw. They saw.
Was it easy? Maybe easy is the wrong term. Was it viable to sell watches online? Forget what their thoughts were. You were selling presumably to mainly the UK market?
No. I mean, it was, okay, let me say this, and I'll say it to this day. The consumer, the customer, the watch fan, I think is the easiest part of the business. That's the easiest part. Because my logic has always been, if you want to buy something from me, I just have to explain not why you should buy it, but what it is I'm selling. And most people, I think, to this day, that grows with the internet, are hungry for information. So I think the consumer, as long as you gave them the right information, as long as you were clear and accurate, that was fine. It was always supply, and then the problems we had with territorial boundaries. So if our business essentially was global, but we were confined to the UK. So at one point, we had to cancel every single order from North America, which probably would have amounted to millions of dollars.
Why is that? Why'd you have to cancel?
Because the brand said to us, you can't sell there.
Oh, because the brands.
The brand said you can't sell there. We have an agent there, which is fine. But my argument would be, well, then I'm creating content and information on social media, on YouTube, on Instagram, and your representative isn't. So if the sale's coming to me and I'm generating it, we need to have a different form of relationship.
Let me clarify the context here for listeners. There is, and it hasn't changed much to this day, unfortunately, but there's this inherent conflict in the watch industry between what happens on the ground, meaning watches are stopped at borders, and what happens on the internet, where really the only border is language.
Yeah.
And so people can easily buy from a retailer who speaks to them but isn't located proximately close to them, yet for reasons related to taxes, business contracts, territorial agreements that may not really represent the reality of how things work, this transaction will either be blocked or be very difficult to go through. Now, some of those things are easier to get around than others. Contractual agreements are easier versus, cities and states and countries that have various types of customs and tax regimes. But for the most part, with the cooperation of the brands, it would be a lot easier to do so, to sell internationally, and a lot more money would be exchanged. Have I generally painted the right picture? How would you add to that or change it?
I think to an extent. I mean, what was happening was it was much deeper than that. So we were getting, I mean, as I said, in the end, the way we were working with brands is we were commissioning products. So we would say, well, okay, well, if you don't want to supply us for X, Danielle, my wife, who is involved in this business, said it has been a designer for many, many years. So she would say, well, if I suggest this and we buy in bulk, if we make you a limited run, and this was very early, how's about that? And that of course interested them. We wanted 50 pieces, 100 pieces, 150 pieces of our design. They were interested in that. But then when you have someone who wants your exclusive edition and they're not in your territory, but they can't buy that in your territory, that's when it becomes sticky, because then people, I think, become frustrated. And we've done a fair amount of commission work. And what I mean by that is we've done watches for military units, we've done watches for supply, unusual watch contracts. And when you have one of those that's very interesting, and I'm a big aviation fan, I've been all my life, and when you've got someone who, as an example, wants to buy a watch for pilots of a squadron which aircraft is retiring, that to me is, I mean, that's fun for me. But then when you say, well, actually, you can't do that order for 50 watches because it's not your territory, but I've been dealing with 6 months, that becomes disappointing because actually it doesn't get dealt with elsewhere.
So you did your thing, which was sell. You got people excited. Yeah. You sold, you collected the money, but then the industry, for a variety of reasons, didn't allow you to fulfill all those expectations. And it must have been really frustrating. When did you realize that the industry was sort of like against you making money, to sort of put it that way? What'd you do about it?
I don't think it was against me making money. I think what it was always, it was just that transition to change. So I think there was a period where, first of all, we'd get more orders in than was expected, and they'd wonder how we'd done that. Then, of course, and I always say this to people, if you go to a watch factory or a watch manufacturer, and you've been to many, it's not as big as you think. I mean, to create 100 watches, especially in Europe, is not that easy. They're not these vast warehouses with watches ready to go. So quite often, we would be running ahead of the manufacturer, and therefore, they just didn't have the stock to keep up with orders. And even if we forward ordered, they then say, well, we need some for other retailers. So I think that, and then the discovery that they could sell direct themselves, meant that if they got an order in on a Monday morning, was it going to go to me where they had to give me a margin, or were they going to sell it direct out the door? They've already been paid for it and easier. So I think there became a conflict, and there still is, between, are you a retailer or are you a marketing person, or do they just don't need retailers at all? Now, I think they want it all, but sometimes it's very hard to for them to balance where their supply is going, especially if it's finite because of movements, because of watchmakers, because of case making, all of those elements.
The industry, especially those elements in places like Switzerland and France, they operate in this mentality, I've noticed, for better or worse, where they're like, oh, you've shown a successful model. Rather than work with you to keep doing it and you manage it, we're just going to take it. So thank you for that model. We're going to try to do it ourselves. Yeah. And then I would say more often than not, to be honest, they then realize like, oh, wait a minute, we lack the culture or actual desire to invest to do that thing. So now we have to figure out someone else to do, but we can't go to the original people because we're too prideful. So we need to go to a sub tier one. And then they've done this like 5 to 10 year exercise when all they need to do is stick with the original partner and both people will be making money. Yet they always try to say, well, we want more. Did you notice a lot of that?
Well, I notice a lot, and to this day benefit from that. So I think that does happen. I think there's always someone who thinks they can do it better or they can cut out a sector. I think you would agree with me probably that local knowledge is everything. If you have a database of customers who you've worked with and trust you, and I've always said this, if someone comes in and spends $500 on a watch, it can be the same customer who will spend $20,000 on a watch. And the industry, first of all, can't understand that why would someone spend $500 when they've got $20,000? The second thing is I think that you build up a database and people trust you, and therefore you've got local knowledge. They know you're there. They know you're in country. And I think the third thing is, yes, I think they have been on that journey. Now, luckily, I now do Helicon Watches, but I still act as a consultant with some of those brands. So a few of them did come to me and say, actually, Jonathan, we do have a relationship with you. Will you consult with me? So I still do that. But I agree. I think it's human nature to say, well, I can do exactly the same as you. I really wouldn't want to run your website or do your articles or do the writing. I mean, for me, that would be too taxing. But communicating with customers is easy, and manufacturing watches is quite easy. So I've learned always leave enough meat on the bone for the people who need to earn a living. That's my motto with this.
I mean, look, it's not a matter of disagreement. I know that some places I've done business with don't automatically go to, oh, we'll do it. They usually like, oh, we're so happy you do that thing well. We do our thing well. Together, we'll do something better well. You know, and I you're right. Maybe part of that is human nature, but also I think that it's learned cultural behavior.
Yeah.
And in America, for example, like you don't necessarily see this. Like, you know, you call the plumber. You're not like, I'm going to watch what the plumber does and try to do it myself next time. That just doesn't end well.
Well, as I said, I was in real estate for 20 years and development and acquisition and planning. And in that industry, if you knew the people in the industry and there was one project which everyone wanted, what you'd end up probably doing is saying, well, I want this element out of it. Would you be interested in doing this? And you'd do a JV. And that would be actually quite fruitful. So in the end, we weren't really competing. We were saying, do you want to go or should we have a go or do you want to do it together instead of fighting each other? So I think that was a culture change that maybe still exists in some parts of this day. But yeah, I think the industry is very defensive. And I think there's a lack of understanding, let's say, what people do and what they contribute.
You want to hear something funny? I've heard Swiss people use the word partnership more times than I wish to think about, especially when they don't even mean partnership. But I have never, not one time, heard them use the term joint venture.
Yeah.
Which is a very powerful concept and essentially encapsulates the heart and spirit of a partnership. But a partnership involves both shared responsibility and shared profit. And if there is no shared responsibility or shared profit, guess what? No partnership.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I think that's has been the issue. But again, as I said, these new things, which I think they saw as quite revelatory, I think, I think were quite a challenge to them. I think, they always said to me, if you could get into the best store in London, because we did distribution as well, if you get in the best store in London, then we're made. And I said, well, don't necessarily guarantee that being in the best store means you're the top of their list. You might be the least important brand of their list. And again, there was a culture shock there about, it wasn't a case of ticking boxes. There was a degree of skill and training and engagement with the brand. And I think that's something that I think whenever you look at someone else's job, I'm sure you don't realize, as you say, the plumber doesn't just have to have the skill to repair. It has to have the tools. It's more than
the tools and the outfit. You can't just look the part and buy all the same stuff.
He has to have the training. He has to have the van to get there. He has to have the gas to put in the van. He has to be insured against it. There's so many more elements to it, make it more complex.
So what ultimately ended the whole venture with being into retail? It was a good go. You had a lot of things right. You were clearly ahead of your time in a lot of ways. What ultimately ended it all?
Well, I think there were two things that ended it, and they were both tragic. The first thing was we were hit by COVID. And sadly, we lost someone to COVID in our house, like in the first 500 people in the UK. So we had a death from COVID. And I think at that time, my wife and I were sitting there going to people, COVID's coming, it's going to change everything. Could be positive, could be negative, but we need to adapt. And we were being told by a lot of our suppliers, it'll be gone in 2 weeks, it only affects old people. A lot of things that actually we found fairly offensive. And because we were, my wife was also very ill with it because the person she'd been with was ill with it and passed away. And I think at that point we said, do you know what, we're in a position whereby we're just going to stop. We're not going to enter this difficult period whereby we're trying to do something, but with no real answers. And we essentially took, I wouldn't say early retirement, but we were able to just stop and say, we're going to think about things, which is often quite good things. The fortunate thing was, as I said to you, 2 or 3 days after we made that decision, a few of the brands who I'd worked with for a long time said, hey, Jonathan, we really like what you do. Could you do this for us? Could you do that for us? So I then became a consultant for them, essentially a consultant, a salesperson, whatever you like. And that support was good. In terms of, they valued what I was doing. They had realized there was a value to it. So that was good. So, I was out of the watch industry for about 3 days. That was the reality.
Now, after that, at some point, you started your own brand. Was that sort of the next stage, or was there some intermediary step?
Well, before that, we started our own brand. So Helicon actually started in 2018.
Oh, okay.
And we'd started it before. And now, as I said, we'd done lots of special projects for people. So We'd done designs for other brands. We'd done concepts for other brands, a few of which went into production, and fairly sizable brands. We'd done a few collabs for organizations and for military. So it was sort of fermenting in the background, but we hadn't sort of had it as its own brand standalone. So I think in 2018 it was founded, and about end of 2019 it was already underway. So we were getting designs done because we had all the contacts. We were already dealing with case makers, movement makers, crystal makers, dial makers, and also Daniel and I. And it's very interesting when you work as a husband and wife team. We very much have different roles. She's always done design. I give her a concept and I go quiet because honestly, I'm not the person to stand over her and do all that. And then she comes back within a few weeks with a first run and we do it. So we're always doing that. So we've got a bank of a lot of ideas of watches that we never were able to persuade a manufacturer and make. And so Helicon was always going. It just was right. Okay, we've got the time. We've got the capital. Let's just go for it. And that's how Helicon has come. And we've done it really, really slowly because it is something very special and personal to us.
Now, when you sold watches, correct me if I'm wrong, you were really broad in your taste. You sold mostly affordable stuff, but it was a broad variety of brands. Watches made in different places from different countries. You got to see different parts of it, what consumers like, what's an efficient business model. And what I mean by that, for those that don't understand, is if you want to charge low amounts for a watch, you have to get a good watch made for a low price, right? Suppliers don't treat you equally. You say a watch costs you $1,000 to make. You can get vastly different products for $1,000 out there. So based upon seeing all that, what did you notice were some of the best practices in terms of like things you should design, places you should get watches made, et cetera?
Well, I think we had lots of partnerships. When I did set up the after sales for quite a few brands in the UK. So as I said, when I went to a manufacturer, I'd head straight to the watchmaker, straight to the stock room to see what their stock supply was like. And of course, whenever there were warranty problems I was coming through, I was down at our workshop just checking what the problems were. So essentially I did it the other way around. I knew what I wanted. I knew my minimum standards of quality, and then I wanted to understand at what price I wanted to bring that into the market. So I think I could have got lots of stuff done, but my personal passion has always been affordable. I've never owned very expensive watches, or if I have, not for long. And I just enjoy watches. I always say to people, it's like shoes. Everyone's got a pair of sneakers. Everyone's got a pair of nice, smart shoes. Everyone's got a pair of boots. So I always look at the inherent beauty of the watch, from its movement, from its dial, from its crystal, and then almost where it's made, and the cost is different. And one thing that I always find difficult and I struggle with is when you've got a watch that costs so much money and I just can't understand why. Whereas you can see a watch that costs so much money and you go, I absolutely get it. And I think for me, it was more about the end goal than the price, if that makes sense. What I want to achieve and what's the best way to achieve it. And it doesn't have to be expensive, but it can be where affordable as long as you are able to make certain decisions at the very early stages.
You said you didn't own expensive watches for very long. Why is that?
They didn't get worn. I felt guilty about wearing them.
Guilty?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always say, I've had some very nice watches, but I'm not comfortable walking around the streets of London with a very expensive watch. I like owning some of them, but I'm saying, once a watch is sat in the safe for 6 months, really a watch, I always say to people, comes alive on your wrist. I've got to wear it, got to see it. And, when I had something that was quite expensive, there was always something else to go on my wrist. And after a year of looking at it sitting there, of going, is this really doing anything for me? There are 3 watches that got away. I still wish I had them. But life moves on.
Does that mean you sold them and you regret it? Is that what that means?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. I regret it, but regret it in terms of I'm surrounded by watches, so life isn't bad. So yeah, but I think those watches that I had, I would say were pinnacles of what I like, and I think they probably are worth more now. But I'm not in this for investment. I'm in it for the love of watches. And I've never owned a Rolex, for instance. It just doesn't do anything for me. I'm not saying it's a bad watch at all. It just isn't something that I gravitate to.
So what was popular? What kind of stuff sold at the sort of height of Page & Cooper and all that?
I think a lot of tool watches, a lot of instrument watches. I think above all, people wanted engineering, so they wanted good quality. I think they did like, and I still in my own mind veer towards the tool watch. Now, the tool watch can have some glamour. And I've always said the dive watch is the ultimate tool watch. It's, the ultimate glamorous watch, in terms of it has a function, but also can be beautiful and takes us back to, I always say, the ages of the jet set, the guys that look really cool and those great Californian pictures where, everything was colourful. And then I think people like something that's functional. They can wear every day and it builds into their lives. So I always think we were recognised for the tool watch. We had some great variants on this with custom editions. But I think quality was foremost in terms of quality of engineering, accuracy in terms of good quality movements, functionality, and then that little bit of glamour. And I think also, I always say to people, when you have a watch that catches the eye, it's a conversation piece. It's the beginning of a conversation with someone. Oh, what's that watch? Oh, it's a X. And then immediately onto a discussion about the brand, the history, where they're made, who some of the people have used them. So I would say it was very much the sort of practical tool watch, the real instrument watch that I think had a great story, both in its engineering and its inception and its use.
Did you ever notice that novel watches are harder to sell? When I say novel, like, really new shapes, some new concepts, because I think there's a perception out there, and I've never been quite clear how it actually pans out in initial sales interest. But they say that sort of this familiar retro style is more easily acceptable and people like it, whereas novel things, by virtue of being new, just takes more time to be accepted and takes people time to warm up, and maybe it takes them a long time to warm up. I'm just wondering if you saw that behavior in customers.
Yes and no. And I think, again, I'll ask your opinion on this. To my mind, before about 2016 and 17, this idea of the vintage watch, the vintage smaller sized watch, wasn't really a thing. People talked about watches being too big, but always our best-selling size watch was 42 millimeters. So I think 42 millimeters was
still the best size.
Exactly. So I think this idea that people would talk about a 38 or 39 really wasn't the industry. I think that has totally transformed now. So smaller watches are in. And I think when you introduce a new K-shape, and I personally love different. I mean, I love avant-garde K-shape, lugless cases that are angular. I mean, there's some amazing cases. I think if you're going to introduce them, you have to introduce them with a degree of reason. There has to be a reason they're introducing. You have to tell a story with it. Sell people why your case is important, how you've reached the design. And I think often people bring in a case and say, it's our new model. And if you're not careful, there's a wave of resentment, especially now with the internet, of why have you changed what we love? So I think, yes, there is a resistance unless you sell it properly. Tell the story of it, tell why you've made that case, why you've engineered it. And I think then it's people adopt it more reason. You've got to give them the reason to move. And I think that's a big important, because I think, especially with the age of influencers and the internet, people do tend to head down a road of least resistance, and again, it's got to be smaller than 35. It's got to be smaller than 36. That's great for a comment. But I can promise you, in my experience, it doesn't translate into sales. We had one brand, we had a 46 millimeter, 41.5 millimeter, and 36 millimeter of the same watch. And we used to have an experiment, which was we'd bring people in and say, don't want anything bigger than 36 millimeter. I would say 50% of the time they'd walk out with the 41.5 or the 46, and they'd come in for the 36.
I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah. And the 36 millimeter was our most returned watch. So people would say, it's perfect, it's just what I need, and they return it. And I did see an American retailer on the website saying, because we can't do this in the UK, it said, if you buy this watch, it is non-returnable. So they would, and that shows you that their perception to the reality is very different. I think, again, that's what a local retailer, someone you can talk to, actually can hopefully guide you to.
I mean, we see this all the time where there's this mantra espoused about any given topic, especially our topic, watches, and people say these crazy things about sizes and this and that, and it's just gobbledygook. I really want everyone from sophisticated veterans of the industry like ourselves to novices to just honestly ignore what people say. If anybody has an opinion, just ignore it. Like literally, like get information from your fellow watch collectors. Information, but opinions. I almost want to say right now, and I think this is quite a bold, radical thing, ignore all opinions because they don't matter. They just don't matter.
when you talked about physicality, people did come and see us, and there were two things we used to do, and I'm sure you've heard it. The first of all, especially with male customers, because now we have many more female customers, they would come in and say, I've only got a slim wrist. And I would immediately take my watch off on a bracelet and say, put that on. And they go, oh, it fits. I go, most men are about the same. You know, I've had one guy who was a bodybuilder who was enormous. You know, we had to use all the extra links. But I said, we're all within about one link or two. I mean, Daniel and I are one link away on our watch. We're just one link away between a 6-inch wrist and 6.75 inch. The second thing I used to say to people is, if I took you to a restaurant, I said, hey, Ariel, you're in London, come to a restaurant. And you said, oh, can I look at the menu? No. I'm going to order Ariel because I know what's great here. And you go, but Ariel, eat what I eat. I think that's a really horrible evening we're going to have together, isn't it?
That's
so
really weird.
Allow people the idea that they've got to make their own choices. And I promise you, I mean, we're doing our first physical events with Helicon in the last 18 months. But, you know, there is this tirade of what people do, especially on some of the social media platforms. It's horrible, it can't do that. And just let it go, guys. You know, I mean, let someone who's got it give an opinion as opposed to, let's shut it down now.
So wait a minute. Now, after you said all that, and I haven't actually checked, so I don't know, but you have one primary Helicon model, right?
Yeah, I mean, the model with, we always wanted to be Helicon. As I said, we're overflowing with ideas. So we are affordable, or we try and be affordable, and we're always limited edition, because we always said to the brands we work with, if you're going to make a limited edition, make it limited, right? Don't give this limited edition of 5,000 watches. That's not limited, right? So we always made small numbers. So Helicon will have one project a year. We start and finish it. And when that's finished, that's the model gone. We won't bring out a Mark II next year. We won't bring out a different dial color. We've got 6 watches, 50 pieces, 300 watches this year. That's our exclusivity. It's great build, it's great affordability, but if you get one, you've got one. Once this watch is finished, there's a new model coming, and it'll be totally different. So my point is that, yeah, we make very small amounts of watches. That's Helicon, just one run a year.
38.5 millimeters. That's not 42.
No, but again, we had a prototype watch. We found a watch in a Swiss manufacturer. I was rummaging around their stock room. I think it was room 149. I found some old bezels and cases in there. I love the watch. I said, what are you going to do with this? They said, don't know, we haven't made it for years. I said, can you turn this one case and bezel into a watch for me? They've got a dial that fit. We mocked up a watch, and it just felt right on the wrist. So we wanted to have a vintage-inspired watch, but actually felt right on the watch. And I think if you put this on the wrist, well, I'm not measuring millimeters. I mean, it feels great and it looks great. That's what I'm after. So it just happened that this old watch all came together, and everyone who put on this watch said, I love it. It feels great. So this watch didn't come from our desire to make a vintage-inspired watch. It came from a watch that we felt was great. That's it.
It just happened to be a vintage-inspired watch.
And I promise you, the next projects are nothing like this. And I'm working on an entirely new case with Daniel at the moment. It's totally off the wall. It's got design features that I haven't seen before. I hope people won't go, well, why didn't you make the vintage watch again? Because, as I said, that story will be over. Because I think that also protects our customers. That gives them a little bit back in knowing that there's not another model out next year or a new iteration.
Do you ever wonder how long the runway is going to be for vintage style sport watches? Like, at some point, the trend has to end. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying if you look at fashion and things like that, there's no like car design that they've been making the same thing for like 70 years, right? Like at some point, it's like, we got to move on. And I'm just wondering if we're ever going to hit that in our lifetimes with watches. Yes.
And that's why I've said to you, this is a watch that has a great colorway. It's got vintage inspiration, but it's great to wear. I think, as I said to you, 2016, 2017, there were no watches. I mean, it's rare to find a watch under 39 millimeters. I think now there's plenty of them out there. And I think things change. And I think my view is we're going to see slightly bigger watches again. We're going to see more modern designs. We're going to see more cutting edge. And I think we're already seeing it. I'm interested how the sort of retro 70s looks have come back again, which were really not popular for a long time.
Not at all.
Not at all. You couldn't have given those watches away. And personally, I don't have it on me, but my original watch, my 1980 Seiko, bought my grandmother, is very much of that sort of 70s, 80s design.
They were great. They were really great. Yeah. Super wearable.
I drove around in an 80s car till 2012. I drove an E28 BMW. And at that point, people are like, why do you want to drive that old car? Of course, now it's like uber cool. Like, oh, man, where did you get that car? But I drove it because I like the engineering. I like the aesthetics for it. I think products have to sit on their own merits. But yeah, I think everything has its time, and I think we'll move on. And I think those designers who are doing clever things, I'm not sure if I should name check anyone, but I think there are guys out there in the micro brand space and in the bigger space that are doing clever things. I think those guys will develop and on go because they always have done. Hopefully we will too, in terms of this is our comfortable vintage inspired piece, and then we'll have other chapters in our story.
The micro brand space, just while we're talking about it, requires something that without it, the space will not really exist. And that is the manufacturing capacity. It is these group of mainly Chinese factories that make, all the parts, the cases and the dials and the hands and things like that, and have the agility to change stuff up and make new things. They can still go to Switzerland and be considered Swiss made and stuff like that. But there's this industrial base, if you will. And I've wondered how stable it is. It didn't grow because of these micro brands. It sort of existed because of these large orders that legacy brands used to make, and they either make it elsewhere or those brands don't exist anymore. But I want to know if you have any thoughts on the stability and permanency, if you could want to call it that, of this manufacturing base. How fragile or robust do you think it is?
I think every manufacturing industry is fragile at the moment. If it's indigenous, whether it's to the USA or the UK, it's extremely fragile. Everything can be done at a cost. And I was thinking about this from listening to your last podcast in terms of, where could we pivot? Now, I think the other thing is that I've been going to Hong Kong since 1992. That was my first visit. So I've been there when it was part of the UK. And I've seen changes there. But I've maintained the same contacts. I mean, Hong Kong to me is an amazing city, and it's an easy city to do business with. I think a lot of people, in that industry, it has shrunk, and there's other demands from other industries for those skills. Even in Germany, I know of a manufacturer who's a watchmaker, but on 2 floors of the buildings, they're now making heart valves. Components for hearts, heart valves. There's a big pull on these manufacturers, the case makers, for phone cases, for crystals, for phones. So I think it is specialized. It is to a degree fragile. And again, I think you're exactly right. These manufacturers are not surviving on micro brand orders. And I think what is good is that some of the big brands, I think, have invested heavily into new models. And I think there is an uptake, which is why I think it's good that there seems to be more and more people joining the watch community, more people of a younger age joining it, and hopefully it will sustain. But I think there's a fragility, and I think, look, we're lucky. I said to you, I acted for other brands. I think probably we've got through about 30,000 units since 2020. And that's not Helicon, that's for other projects. So I'm able to say, hi guys, that project we did, can you do this for me? And again, I've got the relationships because you've got to meet and talk to these people. Working in Europe is very different, of course, but you've got to, I still think, email and PDF and CAD drawings over a file are still a blunt tool when you need to stand there with someone and say, no, if you can do this slightly differently. The communication is everything. And also I've got people who know me. But I think the industry, we have to be mindful that we're going to have to think about many different sources for our manufacturing. And I think we have to also be mindful that we have to pay the right prices and invest in people. And that's what we're doing over there. I mean, I'll be over in Asia in a few weeks and I'll be talking about this very thing to some of my partners there.
You agree, however, that there is a risk because of the fragility of the supply chain that in the foreseeable future, certain things could happen. For example, they couldn't produce the number of watches, which means the opportunities to start a brand will go down. They can't produce for it as cheap. Certain things may not be able to be available at all from certain regions, or may just not be available at certain low price points. And I have a theory. I hope it doesn't happen, but I think sometimes we take for granted it's actually how cheap some of these watches still are. Sometimes we judge them based on mass production prices that really didn't have any type of relevancy past the 80s, maybe the 90s. But we are quite lucky as to how inexpensive some of these beautiful watches are to produce. Forget what you charge for them at a retail price. I think what could easily happen is that wonderful dreamland can go away, and it could cost an awful lot of money just because of the fact that no one's doing it at any scale, or no one specialized or set up to do it. And so just your simple 3-hand watch with an automatic movement could cost a freaking fortune, because it's a specialty item that has to be made by artisans, maybe by hand, because there's no industrial base or supply chain. We still have inherited essentially the leftovers of mechanical watches as things that daily wear needs exist, to it being part of fashion, hobbyist, enthusiast, luxury item, whatever you want to call it. It's not a tool that like nurses need to wear, or that bankers need to have, or that very few people actually have to have it. And so the volumes that we enjoy, I don't know, I just think they have to go down, and so will the cost accordingly of manufacturing have to go up. Anyway, it's just sort of a theory I have.
I don't think it's a theory. I think it's inevitable. I think What you said is exactly right. I think that we are in a golden age of affordable watches. I think there are lots of micro brands out there. I think there are a lot of major brands out there, but I have no doubt in my mind that if you look back from 10 years today, as probably you could do 10 years from now, I think what you will have to pay for a mechanical watch will be vastly different. I think maybe it will still be good value in the pantheon of what we're doing, but I think it's inevitable. I mean, I'm expecting out. I mean, everything we do at Helicon is focused on cost, overhead, and running a business that will sustain. I think there are many people out there, if I may say, who I think any wind of change in terms of increased component costs, supply movement chain problems, I think we're going to have to really readjust their price structure dramatically. And I think it's inevitable. I think what you're saying is absolutely inevitable. And I think also remember, it's the skills. It's the people who want to work in the industry, what their perception is of earnings, wherever they are in the world, and who is prepared to pay them. Now, if just in the UK, I mean, I'm a member of the British Watchmakers Association. We are focused very much on being an association and how we go from small independent micro brands to essentially a market. So if there's one of us ordering from a supplier, it's a customer. If there's 108 of us, which there are now, it's a market. So what I'm saying is, I think what you're saying is absolutely inevitable. I think prices will increase, and probably rightly so.
However, and because I have to be a futurist, it could go a very different direction. If 3D printing technology and precision microengineering becomes as agile as it needs to be for things like space travel, it may be the case that available machines can be so agile in the types of parts they make, you could theoretically make the parts without having to have the old traditional types of know-how to set up these precise processes. I'm not saying it'd be exactly the same, but I'm saying it may be possible to make an inexpensive mechanical watch that's nice looking in a different way, but with a future technology which is in development now, which doesn't exist yet. It is, again, it's hard to say how likely it is, but we know that people today are working on it.
Yeah, and I think there's more. I mean, there are more complex things that we can achieve as a manufacturer now that we couldn't have done 10 years ago. There's technology that I've been offered, especially in movements and things, that I don't even think the market is ready to accept. If I was able to bring in some of the things that I've been offered in my watches.
Like what? I mean, you hooked my attention.
I think.
Are they powered by tiny hamsters?
No, I think we work on traditional automatic movements that are very bulletproof. I think there's a lot of engineering that could be done to those movements. I mean, silicon escapements pretty soon could be available for any movement you choose. And I'm not talking about expensive Swiss movements. I think you could put them in an Asian movement as well. So then if you've got an Asian, a Miyota 9 series, I mean, there is a silicon escapement designed for that. There is for the NH35. The question is the consumer prepared to pay for us to make that investment to have a silicon escapement on NH35? I've seen quite complex movements from Asia, and I'm really interested to see what I'm going to see now, where complication has been layered on complication. Automatic 70-hour tourbillons, hemispherical tourbillons, chronograph modules. The question is, are people going to accept those things? So yes, I think there is an element of that, but I still think that for the amounts that we order, which is hundreds, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,500, when you've got someone who's ordering 10,000 components to have those machines heated up. I mean, let me give you an analogy, or not an analogy, let me give you a fact. There's a case maker we know very well in Germany. At the moment, their case production gives them enough production for 1 week's work. But what they said to me is on Monday, when they start the machine after the weekend, pretty much everything on that machine from Monday at 9 a.m. till 2 p.m. in the afternoon is not usable because the machine has to operate into temperature, right? So in other words, the tolerances are too wide until the machines are up to temperature. They don't have enough orders to run the machines 24/7. If they did, then they'd have 24/7 manufacturing. But because they don't have enough orders, then they've got essentially 4 days of manufacturing. Well, that's a big percentage of your week. Now, if they've got someone who will order wheel bearings, if they've got someone who will order machine gear sticks for cars, or maybe we don't even have those anymore, but you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe that for them is a more sustainable business to keep their business operating effectively. So I think technology is helping. I think CNC is helping. I think finishing is helping. The one thing I can't see at the moment is automatic assembly of mechanical movements. But as you said, hey, let's have a new mechanical movement. I mean, maybe there is a way of doing that. But would the consumers adopt it? And pay for it? That's the key.
I mean, and that's, I think, where the traditional luxury brands come in, because what they've always been the best at is taking something relatively not sexy and making it beautiful and getting consumers to associate with luxury such that others can do it because now consumers are willing to buy it. And I think that for all the hard time we give to the traditional luxury brands in Paris, out of Switzerland and Germany and, and Italy, is they know how to tell the average folk out there, hey, this is now luxury. Carbon fiber. Yes, it is. No, forget what you know about carbon being everywhere. It's precious now.
Yeah.
And that's a magical thing they do. And I think that it's very important of this dream creation that they do. They could do better. They could do more. My next question is, when it comes to the watches you'd like to make, what type of technologies, maybe not in movements and other things, materials or whatever, it's just on the horizon that you just can't wait to use because you think people are going to love it?
I think there's a lot of composite materials that I'd really like to use more. I have done some composite work before, with forged carbon. Ceramics, I think, are an interesting material in terms of the scratch-resistant parts of the watches.
Oh, yeah.
I think, as I said, there's lots of materials we could use for dials that are very different. My question is, how far away do we veer from the traditional that won't jeopardize sales? And I think we touched that before. So again, I think there's forged carbon. I think there's ceramics. I think there's a lot of grades of titanium that could be used. But I always find this very, very difficult because I do like the traditional elements of a watch. I am not a fan of titanium watches because I feel they feel light and insubstantial. On the other hand, I do have this vision in my head of almost like a forged carbon case with a hybrid movement inside of it, with an analog quasi-digital display on it. So, and again, what functions we could put on that. So I think, and I am a big fan of digitals, sort of quartz as well. I mean, I think there's some great quartz movements in there with some really interesting complications. The question is it a risk too far for me to take? Now, you talked about those Swiss luxury brands being very good at marketing it, but as a micro brand, as a small brand, we just don't have those budgets. So I think there's a lot of things out there. I mean, we'll be working on every watch coming in to introduce something new. And I think and we've got a 10-year plan. On the final watch, I think if this goes to plan, I think it will be didn't see that coming. But,
So here's something that I'd like to solve and like your input on it. And it's an interesting observation. It has to do with originality and where it's birthed. Now, if you ask the big brands, they're like, where are the original designs coming from? They're like, oh, leave it to the independents. And they're really thinking of the established independents, like the MB&Fs of the world. They can go crazy, but their watches are, over 100,000 the vast majority of the time. And, they have this very well-established network of people that would make just about any shape they want beautifully. But the reality is that when an artist or someone with that type of very radical design mentality goes independent, they have a lot of trouble on their own. There's very few exceptions out there, like the Alan Silbersteins of the world, who, again, had trouble on his own, even though his stuff was pretty well taken. But the reality today, from what I've seen, is that you have a very radical concept for a watch, a new, fresh design direction. As a micro brand, it is really, really challenging. If you have sort of a watch that fits into an archetype, like a dive watch, a vintage style watch, something that people are familiar with, and you just sort of have a good price and a little bit of a tweak, you can do really, really well. How do we fix the problem that the real artists and creatives, those people that have that bravery that we really admire, how can we get them into the micro brand space where A, people will buy it, and B, their stuff will get made because it's so radically not a round steel case much of the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of creative talent out there. I mean, we're always looking for it. I mean, that's why, when I visit my manufacturers, I'm always interested in speaking to the guys in design. And again, because I'm working with other brands as well, I'm always fascinated by what comes through. So I think there is talent out there. I think that
the ideas are there. I agree.
Oh,
the ideas are there.
Okay, I think that market is coming towards it. I inferred that before. I think people are becoming much more accepting, much more tolerant.
Yeah.
But I think you have to feed it to the consumer in a way that they can understand it and they find it palatable. And I think, look at electric cars. We're all being talked about electric cars, hybrid cars at the moment. My view on electric cars, and I've always driven in the last few years very small cars. I mean, I live in the city. I love cars. I love driving. I've owned some great cars, but I think, I'm a city dweller now. I like a small car, and why shouldn't it be energy efficient? And actually, here's a good example. I had a smart car. I've had 3 smart cars in London.
Okay.
Actually devised by Swatch, weren't they? I mean, Swatch started the smart. It was a joint venture with Mercedes.
Yeah, the original one. Yeah.
Now, universally, I was pilloried for driving that car. I mean, why are you driving that crazy car? It's all plastic. It'll roll over. I think what was the mistake was they didn't market it well enough. And I think even now with electric cars, we're being shown cars that are powered by electricity, but look like normal cars. I think you have to make a design statement that is so bold that people actually go, do you know what? That is cool. It moves people. And I think those things have done. I remember when I had the first iPhone and my friends had Blackberries. Why do you want an iPhone? I mean, it was Blackberries are the thing, So I think you need someone who's really going to invest in that and tell people why they should have it. But I think the market is coming towards it. I think you've got a new generation who actually are looking for new materials, new ideas and designs. So I think the two, in my view, are going to converge. They're going to converge. I think you're going to find that someone's going to be brave enough to introduce a new watch in a new design, new materials, and actually there'll be a champion. And I think we've seen a few releases in the last few months that have been pretty off the wall with different materials, and they've been really successful.
Okay, that's encouraging. I hope you're right. I've just done this enough times to see the viscerally bad reactions some people can have to something new that itself they might turn around and love 10 years later. But I have seen time and time again watches that are brand new be hated and then sort of, as they sort of burn in, be loved. It's not universally true, of course. There's watches that just nobody ends up liking. But I remember having conversations with certain famous car designers, and they just said, like, we consider it a law of the universe that if you design something new, consumers are going to hate it. That's just, and I just take that as a form of gospel now. It's like, if there's going to be a new watch, expect people to hate it before they love it.
Okay. Well, a good analogy I've got for that is Julian Thompson, who's one of our good customers, who is the designer. He was at Lotus, designed the Lotus Elise.
Okay.
So that small, tiny sports car. And he designed a car that was super lightweight, made out of aluminium tubes, glued together. I mean, it was glued together in a fiberglass body. Now, that car, I think, was a big success. It saved the company. I mean, very niche. But by using all the elements together, the engines in the back, it's very light. It's a glued aluminium chassis. I think he ended up, it was a complete story. It wasn't just look at this wacky watch. And I think sometimes you've got to look at the whole story. I also beg to differ. And I think there are a couple of brands out there that are selling watches that are totally off the wall with lots of different crazy features. I work with one of the brands quite closely, and I think it's a big sales success, but they're not selling through traditional sales routes. They are not releasing their things on the usual forums and the websites and the stores. They're going a different route to market. And I think you may find that some of those things come at a market from a totally different direction because people will be totally focused on doing something different. And I think some of the watches, are not to my taste, but I really admire the design. And sometimes I see it when I go, that is clever. So, and I think, that's going to be quite interesting about how you reach a different consumer.
How are they selling them? I mean, I know that there's other ways than the traditional routes. Which ways are you referring to?
Direct, on television channels. There's a lot of TV shopping out there, which is a big sticky audience,
Television.
Which I work with, through lots of different magazines. They do a lot with space and sci-fi and exploration, exploration underseas and stuff like that. So I think they've said, no, we're going to do our own thing. Yeah, we have a digital presence, but that's a really sticky audience. And I know personally, because I'm involved with some of the projects, consumers who don't have one watch, they've got 5, 6, 7.
So basically targeted advertising, just not to a watch per se reader. Someone that might like watches but isn't sitting there browsing about watches. I
think someone who admires engineering and collectability and a good story. I mean, that's I think that the whole part of it.
Oh, I agree. I mean, look, it's hard enough to get brands that make watches to advertise in watch media. I know this. To get them to advertise somewhere else that isn't immediately talking to people that buy watches is so freaking difficult. So difficult such that when some little brand figures out that they can do it, they're so successful because there's other publications that are about engineering, as you said, have no watch brand advertisers. The reader's like, oh, this is cool. But if Tag Heuer had been there for 10 years, then they'd be buying Tag Heuer's. Tag Heuer has literally never thought to advertise there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also, being very proud of their storytelling and description of their product and hanging with it, and again, because of the internet, because of the way that you can communicate, because you can get your own fans to share their own stories, I think they've been very successful. And they've done lots of good collabs as well. I mean, smart collabs, really smart and interesting collabs. And look, we haven't touched on that. Maybe the new way forward sometimes is to do some great collabs with the right people because, we've done collabs for people and sometimes they can be very successful and not in the direction you think of.
What for you typifies a good collab? And alternatively, what are some of the collaboration mistakes that you see?
The biggest collaboration mistake is generally the same one, which is a partner puts their badge on it and walks away. They put their badge on it and just walk away in terms of, yes, you can talk about, our car product or whatever. They put it on the badge and they don't share the product on their own social media. They don't talk to their own fans about it. They don't proudly say we're collaborating. They just sell it as a collab. Stick your badge on that and thank you very much and we'll take it off to you. That's the most.
But that doesn't sound like a collaboration. That sounds like we are using the word collaboration, but since there's no word police on the internet, no one's going to check to see if it actually will. I would argue that's not even a collaboration to begin with. That's just lying.
Okay, well then, fair enough. I agree. I mean, that's it. The best ones are when they've actually taken that watch and used it. They've used it. They've shown they're using it. They've adapted it for their purpose. And they've built a little relationship on it, and that's it.
Do you think that the world needs more collaborations? Do we hit a stride? Are they going to be less? I know it's of course difficult to know what's going to happen, but based upon your own appetite, are you still keen to see what can happen through collaborations, or do you think we've seen most permutations of what the business model can look like?
I think there's always someone who can come up with something new and refreshing and individual. And that, as you said, is a proper collaboration. I think if you can really bring two worlds together, and there are many worlds that haven't been brought together with timekeeping, then I think it could be really interesting. So I think it's got to be an equal input from both. I think you've got to both have some real validity to add.
Where do you think all the unwanted used watches should go?
Where should they go?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the good thing about watches is they shouldn't really ever run out, should they? I mean, we should be able to keep most, especially mechanical watches, going ad infinitum, really. It's the cost of servicing and partnering. But I think all watches had value. And I think there are some now retailers who are specializing in selling not just the most expensive watches. They're selling interesting and individual watches. There's a great one in London at the moment who every day does a video about what you can buy for this many pounds. This is what you could buy for £200. And there's quite a few nice Swiss watches there that are just watches that are not on most people's pantheon. And they go, I think, up to about $2,000. So from my point of view, I think that watches should always have a life. And I think certainly if you have spare watches, give them to a young person. I mean, if there's watches that you don't use, give them to a young person. I think everyone still remembers their first watch. And it's not just giving them something with real meaning, but it's also giving them the responsibility of time. I know that you can tell your time on a phone. I know you can tell your watch the time on a wrist computer, because I'm not going to call them smartwatches, they're wrist computers. But I think when someone gives you a watch, that is a meaningful gift. So if you give a young person a watch, I think they do wear it with pride. And I think I've got a very good customer. He has earmarked every one of his watches, whatever their value, to he doesn't have children of his own, but to his nieces and nephews. And he said, you are going to get this watch. I think you should always, if you can't sell it, gift it to someone, because someone will want that watch and it will have meaning.
I think that's a great response, and I agree that young people truly cherish watches. They would never spend the money on it.
No.
It seems like such a frivolous thing. They can't afford it, but they will wear it for years. They really will. Part of the reason I asked the question, we're sort of ending on this, is because if you do the math, there's a lot more watches being made each year than people are wearing or buying.
Yeah.
And I worry about these unsold watches flooding the market, ruining pricing again. We sort of finally got out of that era. And I realized there needs to be a way of selling them at a discount to people that, I guess it's a crazy sale, but they can't go and buy, a crazy watch all the time like that. But there needs to be a way of selling them in person, but, for that $500 amount, right? Not the thousands of dollar amount, but what it's really worth.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be all those people out there that really, really want it. And I think it's been this snooty thing by some people who wear luxury watches. Are like, I had to spend $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 on this. I don't want just anyone wearing a watch. And I think that mentality is kind of maybe misguided, where a 5 to 10 year old, watch that retailed for, $3,000, it should be on just some regular person's wrist out there. I mean, maybe it's kind of silly, but there's enough watches out there that no one should have a naked wrist. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but if you think about it, it's a really nice way of making sure these watches live on and don't hoard, the gray market.
Why do we have to prescribe everything with a value? Why is it worth in its monetary value?
Because factories cost money, man.
No, but I mean in terms of from when you've got it. I'm saying, when you pass it on to someone, the value is far more than the monetary value. If you give someone that watch. So I'm saying, yes, there has been a trade of, I want to buy this because it will never lose money or I'll gain money. I mean, that stung a few people in the last year or so, people investing quite heavily in things. But I think intrinsically you should buy something because you love it, because you think it's going to work well, and because you want to own it, because it gives you that warm feeling. So I think we've got to get our mindset away from this. Everything's an investment. I mean, we went through COVID where everyone was going to buy a car and that was an investment and everything was an investment. And now it's cooled off a bit. I'm a big vinyl collector. I don't collect vinyl because I want to make money. I collect it because I like listening to vinyl.
Maybe the worst reason to collect vinyl.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, from my point of view, buy something because it gives you pleasure and many years of pleasure. And that's the other thing. No software updates. No new battery needs to be installed in. If it is, it's a modular battery on a quartz watch. It'll just run. My 1980 Seiko quartz is still running. It hasn't ever had a service. And I rang Seiko and said, can you service it? And they said, yeah, we know someone who can. So I'm saying, buy it for its intrinsic value. But I think, pass it on. I think there's always a value for a nice looking watch. Just, it has to be realistic. But I think, we all change our tastes and we all aspire to own these things. That's what we're working hard to do. Things give us pleasure, whether it's clothes, watches, headphones on our heads. It's all about things. And I think there's an intrinsic value, which is what you earn to achieve that. So I think there should be no reason for watches to end their lives.
Very good. Jonathan, we're out of time, but use this moment to plug anything that you want to let people know about. Let them know where they can find out more about you and the company on the internet.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So we're the Helicon Watch Company. It's a joint husband and wife team. Dallin and myself do everything ourselves. And you can find us on heliconwatches.com.
This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Jonathan Bordell. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.